Imagine the silence of a mountain peak, so cold it turns breath into ice. Now, imagine the desperate screams of 87 souls trapped beneath 20 feet of snow, forced to make a choice that would haunt history forever. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a descent into the darkest corners of the human soul. They were families, dreamers, and pioneers. But by the end, they were something else entirely. This is the true story of the Donner Party. And the mountains, they never forget. The year was 1846. The air in Springfield, Illinois was thick with the scent of blooming apple blossoms and the electric hum of ambition. James Reed, a wealthy businessman with piercing eyes and a restless spirit, stood amidst his sprawling estate. He wasn't looking at his land. He was looking west. Beside him stood George Donner, a man of 60, whose face was etched with the quiet wisdom of a life well lived, yet his heart still beat with the hunger for one last great adventure. They were caught in the grip of Oregon fever, a collective madness sweeping across a young America, promising gold, fertile soil, and a new beginning under the golden sun of California. "The maps say it's 2,000 miles, George," Reed said, his voice low but steady. "A long way to drag a family." George smiled, patting the side of a massive custom-built wagon. "The wilderness is just a road we haven't paved yet, James. Think of the children, a life of sunshine, away from the politics and the grime of the East." They weren't poor refugees. They were the elite of the pioneer world. Reed had built a palace wagon, a 2-story behemoth with a built-in stove and velvet-cushioned seats for his wife, Margaret, who suffered from agonizing migraines. They packed fine china, bolts of silk, and thousands of dollars in hidden compartments. They believed they could bring civilization into the wild. In April 1846, by the time the party reached Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the West, the atmosphere was frantic. Hundreds of wagons were jockeying for position, creating a dusty, chaotic metropolis of canvas and wood. It was here that James Reed first heard the name that would change their destiny: Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a charismatic young man who had published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In it, he spoke of a shortcut, a route that would shave hundreds of miles off the journey by cutting south of the Great Salt Lake. "It's a gamble, James," Margaret Reed whispered one night by the campfire, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. "The seasoned mountain men, they say the old path is the only way. Why risk it?" James looked into the fire, his ambition blinding him to the subtle shifts in the wind. "Time is our enemy, Margaret. If we get to California a month early, we get the best land. We get the future." As they moved across the vast, rolling tallgrass prairies of what is now Kansas and Nebraska, the journey still felt like a grand outing. They feasted on fresh buffalo meat and sang songs under a canopy of stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds. But the pace was slow. The heavy wagons sank into the mud, and the oxen grew weary. The first crack in their resolve appeared at Fort Laramie. A weathered mountain man named James Kleiman, who had just traveled the Hastings Cutoff in reverse, pulled Reed aside. The shortcut was a lie. Instead of a clear path, the party found themselves hacking a road through dense forests and over jagged cliffs where no wagon had ever passed. What should have taken a week took 21 grueling days. The men were exhausted, their hands bleeding, their tempers fraying. Every day spent swinging an axe was a day the winter moved closer. By the time they cleared the mountains and reached the Great Salt Lake Desert, they were already behind schedule. And then they saw the salt. It was a shimmering white wasteland that stretched to the horizon, looking like a frozen lake. The heat was oppressive, rising in waves from the ground, creating shimmering mirages of water that vanished as they approached. "We must cross it in 2 days, Reed commanded, his voice cracking from thirst. But 2 days turned into 6. The salt wasn't solid. It was a thin crust over deep, sticky mud. The wagons sank to their axles. The oxen, driven mad by thirst, broke their yokes and bolted into the desert, never to be seen again. The Reed family was forced to abandon their palace wagon, the symbol of their status, now a rotting hull in the middle of a salt desert. Desperation began to erode their humanity. Food was being rationed. Tensions boiled over when a teamster named Snyder lashed out at James Reed's oxen. A fight broke out, a blur of dust, shouting, and a flashing knife. When the dust settled, Snyder lay dead, and James Reed stood over him, blood on his hands. The party held a makeshift trial in the wilderness. Some called for Reed's head. Instead, they chose a punishment that felt like a death sentence: banishment. They sent him out into the desert with nothing but a horse and a rifle, forbidding him from taking his wife or children. As Reed rode away, disappearing into the heat haze, Margaret stood alone with her 4 children, watching the only man who could protect them vanish. They were now a leaderless, fractured group limping toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. And above them, the first dark clouds of the season were gathering over the high peaks, thick, heavy, and silent. The banishment of James Reed left a vacuum of hope. The party was now a collection of ghosts drifting through the alkaline dust of the Nevada desert. Their cattle were dying, their water barrels were empty, and the once proud pioneers were now scavenging for berries and insects. Every eye was fixed on the horizon, where the Sierra Nevada mountains rose like a wall of granite and ice, mocking their progress. "We have to move faster," George Donner urged, his voice thin and raspy. He had injured his hand while repairing a wagon axle, a small cut that was now turning a sickly shade of purple. He didn't tell his wife, Tamsin, but the fever was already beginning to cloud his vision. As they reached the foot of the Sierras, the weather turned. The sweltering heat of the desert was replaced by a wind that bit through their threadbare clothes like a serrated knife. They reached a place called Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, just a few miles from the summit. If they could cross the pass today, they would be on the downslope to the lush valleys of California. But the mountains had other plans. That night, the sky didn't just snow, it collapsed. Large, wet flakes fell with a terrifying weight. By morning, 5 feet of white powder buried the wagon wheels. The oxen, the very engines of their survival, were buried alive in the drifts. The pioneers poked the snow with long poles, trying to find the carcasses of their animals to butcher for meat, but the mountain had swallowed them whole. They were trapped. Only 150 miles from safety, but it might as well have been the moon. They began to build makeshift shelters, huts made of pine branches and ox hides. The Breen family took over a pre-existing cabin, while the Donners were forced to camp 6 miles back at Alder Creek, shivering under tents as the snow piled higher than the rooftops. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the sound of coughing and the rhythmic thud of snow falling from the trees. November turned into December, and the Palace of the Sierras became a tomb. Inside the cabins, darkness reigned. The only light came from small fires that filled the cramped spaces with choking smoke. Margaret Reed sat in the corner of her hut, clutching her children. They had finished the last of the dried meat weeks ago. Now they were eating glue, a foul, gelatinous mess made by boiling strips of oxhide until they dissolved. It tasted like burnt hair and leather, but it kept the stomach from collapsing on itself. "Mama, I'm not hungry anymore," her youngest, Tommy, whispered. That was the most terrifying sign of all. In the Sierras, when you stopped feeling hungry, it meant your body had begun to consume itself. The desperation led to an impossible decision. A group of 15 of the strongest emigrants, men, women, and even a 12-year-old boy, decided they would attempt to cross the pass on foot. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They fashioned crude snowshoes from ox yokes and hide, and with only a few days' worth of hide strips for food, they began to climb. Among them were two Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, who had been sent from California with supplies earlier, but were now trapped with the rest. As the group ascended into the freezing white void, the wind screamed. On the third night, a blizzard struck with such ferocity that they lost their fire. They huddled under a single blanket, a mass of shivering humanity, as the snow buried them alive. When the storm cleared 2 days later, 3 of them were dead. The survivors looked at each other. Their eyes were sunken, their minds fractured by starvation. They looked at the bodies of their friends, then at each other. No one spoke, but the thought hung in the air like a physical weight. If they didn't eat, they would all die. It was Patrick Dolan who had suggested a lottery earlier, to see who should be sacrificed. While the forlorn hope struggled through the mountains, the situation at the lake camp descended into a waking nightmare. Death was now a daily visitor. At Alder Creek, George Donner lay dying in his tent. His arm was a mass of gangrene, the infection spreading to his chest. His wife, Tamsin, a woman of incredible intellect and strength, refused to leave his side, even as her children grew weaker. "You must take the girls and go when the rescuers come," George whispered, his breath smelling of decay. "I will not leave you to die alone in the snow, George," she replied, her voice ironclad. She was a schoolteacher, a botanist, a dreamer. Now she was a witness to the end of her world. Back at the lake, the Breen cabin had become a place of grim prayer. Patrick Breen kept a diary, his entries becoming shorter and more haunting. February 5th. Peggy very uneasy. Individual's meat is nearly all gone. Confined to the house by snow. A hard life. The children had forgotten what bread tasted like. They played with the bones of dead oxen, pretending they were toys, before boiling those same bones for the 3rd or 4th time to extract any lingering grease. Then, one evening, a cry rang out through the trees. "Hello! Hello!" The survivors crawled out of their holes in the snow, blinking at the blinding white light. Coming down the mountain was a small group of men, the first relief. Among them was a face Margaret Reed never thought she'd see again. James Reed had made it to California, raised a rescue party, and fought his way back through the winter to find his family. The scene that met the rescuers was beyond anything they had imagined. The pioneers didn't look like humans. They looked like skeletons draped in rags, their skin stretched tight over yellowed bone. "Are you men from California?" one woman asked, falling to her knees. "Or are you from heaven?" But the relief was short-lived. The rescuers could only carry so much food, and they could only take a few people back with them. A horrific choice had to be made. Who stays and who goes? The first relief managed to lead 21 survivors out of the white hell, but the journey back was a gauntlet of death. Among them were the younger Reed children, their legs so weak they had to be carried over the frozen drifts. As they trekked across the summit, a second massive blizzard slammed into the mountains. The wind was so fierce it tore the breath from their lungs. The rescuers, exhausted and freezing, realized they couldn't save everyone. They had to leave a group, mostly children and the elderly, at a spot that would later be known as Starved Camp. When the storm finally broke and the second relief, led by James Reed himself, reached Starved Camp, they witnessed a sight that broke even the most hardened mountain men. The survivors had been sitting in a hollowed-out pit in the snow for days. Many were dead. Those who were alive were huddled around a fire, and the remains of the dead had been butchered. James Reed found his daughter Patty, still alive, but she was barely a whisper of a girl. He wrapped her in his coat, his heart shattering as he looked around at the carnage. He had spent months dreaming of this reunion, only to find his family in the middle of a literal charnel house. But even as some were saved, the drama at the lake camp was reaching its peak. Louis Kiesberg, a German immigrant with a cold, piercing gaze, remained in the cabins with the dying. He was a man who would soon become the most hated figure in American pioneer history. By March 1847, the camps at the lake and Alder Creek were no longer communities. They were sites of primal survival. Almost all the cattle were gone. The hides were gone. The only thing left was the unthinkable. At Alder Creek, the situation was particularly dire. Tamsen Donner was still tending to her dying husband, George. Her daughters had been taken away by a rescue party, leaving her alone with a man whose body was slowly rotting away. When the third relief arrived, they found Tamsen surprisingly strong, despite her hunger. They begged her to leave. "The mountains are melting, Tamsen. The snow will turn to mud soon. You must come now." She looked at George, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. He couldn't be moved. The slightest touch made him scream in agony. "My place is here," she said, her voice steady. "When he passes, I will follow you. Not before." The rescuers left her. She was the last person seen alive at the Donner campsite who still possessed a shred of her former self. A few miles away at the Breen cabin, Louis Keseberg was alone with a few children who were too weak to move. When the final rescue party, the fourth relief, arrived in April, they didn't find a group of survivors. They found a nightmare. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the bodies of those who had died months ago, now partially consumed. And in the center of it all was Keseberg. He was sitting next to a pot of human flesh, his face smeared with grease. When the rescuers asked where Tamsen Donner was, Keseberg pointed to a bucket. He claimed she had died of cold and exhaustion, and he had only eaten her to survive. But the rescuers found her money, over $500 in gold, hidden in his pack. The suspicion was immediate and dark. Had he murdered the last lady of the Donner Party for her gold? The survivors who finally reached the green valleys of California were changed forever. They were the walking dead. Their bodies were covered, but their souls scarred by what they had seen and what they had done. Of the 87 who started the journey, only 47 survived. The Donner name, which George had hoped would stand for a new beginning, became a synonym for the ultimate taboo. For decades, the survivors remained silent. They moved to different towns, changed their names, and tried to bury the memory of the winter of 1846. But history wouldn't let them forget. In the years that followed, Virginia Reed, who was only 12 when she survived the ordeal, wrote a letter to her cousin back east. Her words became the epitaph for the entire tragedy. "Remember," she wrote, "never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." The site of their suffering is now a beautiful state park. People picnic where the huts once stood, and children play where the forlorn hope began their desperate march. But when the wind howls through the pines of the Sierra Nevada, some say you can still hear the echo of the wagon wheels and the faint, ghostly whispers of those who were promised a paradise but found only a white tomb. The story of the Donner Party remains the ultimate testament to the human spirit, both its incredible will to survive and the terrifying depths it can reach when the lights of civilization go out. They were ordinary people who met an extraordinary winter, and in the silence of the snow, they discovered exactly who they were. The ordeal did not end when the survivors reached the sun-drenched valleys of California. For many, the nightmare was just beginning. As the emaciated figures of the Donner Party were brought into Sutter's Fort, the local community looked on with a mixture of pity and absolute horror. The physical recovery was slow and agonizing. Their stomachs, shrunken by months of starvation, could not handle solid food. Many became violently ill after their first real meal. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the social isolation. Word of the cannibalism had spread like wildfire through the frontier. Louise Kieserberg, the man found alone with the remains of Tamsin Donner, became the primary target of public hatred. He was accused of murder, not just survival. As the years passed, the trail that the Donner Party had struggled to forge became a highway for the California gold rush of 1849. Thousands of wagons began to pass the very spots where the cabins had stood. But the new pioneers didn't see the suffering. They saw the debris. The ruins of the cabins became a macabre tourist attraction. Passing travelers would stop to scavenge for souvenirs, a piece of a broken wagon, a rusted kettle, or even fragments of bone. The site at Donner Lake became a physical scar on the landscape of the American West. But what happened to the children? The orphans of the snow had to forge lives in a state that was rapidly changing. Eliza Donner, who was only 4 years old when she was rescued, spent much of her life trying to reconstruct the truth of her parents' final days. She refused to believe the sensationalist newspaper stories that painted her mother as a victim and Kieserberg as a monster. In her later years, Eliza tracked down the survivors, collecting their stories to ensure the world knew that her parents weren't just cannibals. They were pioneers who had been betrayed by a map and a winter that defied logic. She wrote books to humanize the victims, describing her mother Tamsin's love for botany and her father George's dreams of a ranch. She turned the Donner Party from a horror story back into a human tragedy. The legacy of the Donner Party eventually changed how America looked at its own expansion. The manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to settle the entire continent, had a dark side, and the Donners were its most famous casualty. Archaeologists would later return to Alder Creek and Donner Lake, digging through the dirt to find the truth. They found tiny fragments of charred bone, but they also found something else: small, colorful beads. These were the toys of the Donner children, carried thousands of miles, only to be dropped in the mud. It was a reminder that these weren't just names in a history book. They were families who loved, laughed, and hoped. Today, if you stand at the Donner Pass, you will see a massive monument. The pedestal is exactly 22 feet high, the depth of the snow during that fateful winter of 1846. It stands as a silent sentinel over the mountains, honoring the endurance of the human spirit. The story of the Donner Party is a mirror. It asks us, what would you do to save your child? How far would you go to survive? And when everything is stripped away, food, warmth, dignity, what remains of the human soul? They were dreamers who took a wrong turn, and though their journey ended in a white tomb, their story remains etched into the granite of the Sierras, a chilling, heart-wrenching, and ultimately immortal chapter of the American dream. While the survivors tried to rebuild their shattered lives, the man who started it all, Lansford Hastings, was still out there. He wasn't in the snow, and he wasn't starving. He was in the warm valleys of California, dreaming of power. The Hastings cutoff had been a marketing ploy, a way for him to gain fame and perhaps lead a new republic. When news reached him of the Donner Party's fate, he didn't offer an apology. Instead, he continued to promote his guide. But the ghosts of the Sierra Nevada followed him. Everywhere he went, the names of the dead, the Donners, the Murphys, the Reeds, were whispered like a curse. The survivors, meanwhile, were facing a different kind of trial, the trial of memory. For young Virginia Reed, the nightmare didn't end with a warm meal. Years later, she would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she could still smell the wet oxhide boiling over a smoky fire. The trauma was a silent companion. She became deeply religious, perhaps as a way to find meaning in a winter that seemed utterly godless. James Reed, despite his flaws, became a successful man in California, helping to organize the early government. But he always carried a hidden weight. He knew that his own pride, his own insistence on taking that shortcut, had led his family to the brink of hell. He spent the rest of his life ensuring his children never wanted for anything, as if trying to pay back a debt to the mountain that could never be settled. As the mid-1850s arrived, the story of the Donner Party took a strange and macabre turn in the public imagination. They weren't just seen as victims anymore, they became the boogeymen of the West. Parents would tell their children, "Don't wander off, or you'll end up like the Donners." This social stigma forced many survivors into a pact of silence. The Breen family, who had survived intact thanks to their iron will and religious faith, rarely spoke of the lake. They settled in San Juan Bautista, turning their home into an inn. Ironically, travelers would stay there, eating at their table, never realizing that the kind, quiet people serving them had once lived through the most famous case of cannibalism in history. But for Louis Keseberg, there was no such escape. He was the human beast in the eyes of the public. He tried to run a restaurant in Sacramento, but people refused to eat there, joking darkly about the secret ingredient. He ended his days in poverty, living in a small shack, a pariah in the land of plenty. One day, years later, Eliza Donner Houghton, George Donner's youngest daughter, went to visit Keseberg. She wanted to look into the eyes of the man who supposedly ate her mother. What she found wasn't a monster, but a broken, weeping old man who fell to his knees and swore by all that was holy that he hadn't killed Tamsin. "I was a victim of the mountains, just like you," he sobbed. Whether he was lying or telling the truth, that secret died with him in the dust of California. The landscape itself began to change, but the evidence of the tragedy remained stubborn. In the late 19th century, a massive drought hit the Sierras, and the water levels of the lake dropped significantly. Locals walking the shoreline found something protruding from the mud, the heavy iron rim of a wagon wheel. As they dug, they found more: chains, rusted tools, and even a small locket containing a braid of hair. It was as if the earth was tired of holding the secret and was finally spitting the tragedy back up. These artifacts became the first pieces of a puzzle that historians are still trying to solve today. Modern science has stepped in where memories failed. In recent years, forensic anthropologists analyzed the hearth sites at Alder Creek. Using high-tech equipment, they searched for human DNA in the bone fragments found in the cooking pits. The results were surprising. While there was evidence of extreme desperation, they found more bones of dogs, horses, and even deer than they expected. It suggests that the cannibalism might have been the very last agonizing resort, not a widespread practice as the sensationalist newspapers of the 1840s had claimed. The truth was more complex. It was a story of people trying to stay human for as long as they possibly could, until the very last spark of hope was extinguished by the frost. The survivors were safe, but the Sierra Nevada had left its mark on their DNA. However, there was a group of heroes whose names are often lost in the shadow of the Donner tragedy: the relief parties. These were not government soldiers or paid mercenaries. They were ordinary settlers in California who, upon hearing of the disaster, dropped their plows and picked up their snowshoes. Among them was John Stark, a man of legendary strength and an even larger heart. During the second relief, when the group reached the starved camp, other rescuers were forced to leave behind 9 people, mostly children, because they were too weak to walk and the supplies were gone. They were left to die in a hole in the snow. But John Stark refused to accept this. He returned alone. In a feat that defies physical logic, Stark carried 2 children at a time on his back for a few yards, set them down, and went back for the next 2. He did this for miles, through waist-deep snow, laughing and singing to the terrified children to keep their spirits up. While the world remembers the cannibalism of the Donner Party, the mountains also bore witness to Stark's superhuman compassion. He saved all 9. He proved that even in the coldest winter, the fire of human decency could not be extinguished. As California transitioned from a chaotic frontier to the 31st state of the Union in 1850, the Donner Party survivors found themselves living in a paradox. The very mountains that had tried to kill them were now being bored through by Chinese labor crews building the first transcontinental railroad. By the 1860s, steam engines were roaring through the Donner Pass. Passengers in velvet-lined rail cars would sip tea and look out the window at the rugged cliffs, oblivious to the fact that just 20 years earlier, people were eating their shoelaces to survive on that very ground. One survivor, Louis Keseberg, lived long enough to see the Iron Horse conquer the mountains. He remained a recluse, but his presence was a living ghost in the burgeoning city of Sacramento. The Keseberg curse became a local legend. It was said that anything he touched withered. Yet, in his final interview, he made a haunting observation. The hunger, he said, his voice a dry rattle, never truly leaves you. You can eat a feast every day for 40 years, but the soul remembers what it's like to be empty. The Donner Party tragedy essentially ended the era of the unregulated trail. It forced the U.S. government to establish more forts and better mapping, ensuring that no other family would ever be lured into a shortcut that didn't exist. The final mystery of the Donner Party lies not in how they died, but in the items they chose to keep until the very end. When the final cabin was burned to the ground by rescuers to prevent the spread of disease, the ashes held secrets that only modern archaeology could reveal. They found expensive French lace, fragments of a math textbook, and a tiny silver thimble belonging to Tamsin Donner. Even when she was starving, even when she knew death was certain, she kept these symbols of civilization and motherhood. It tells us that they never gave up on the idea of being human. They weren't savages. They were sophisticated people caught in a cosmic trap. The story of the Donner Party is often told as a horror movie, but its true power lies in its reflection of the American spirit, a spirit of restless ambition that sometimes leads to greatness and sometimes leads to the abyss. As the sun sets over Donner Lake today, the water turns a deep, bruised blue. The monument casts a long shadow over the pine trees. It is a place of peace now, but the silence is heavy. It is a silence that honors the 42 who died and the 47 who lived to tell the world that the wilderness is beautiful, but it is also indifferent. And in that indifference, we find the true measure of our courage. The aftermath of the Donner Party wasn't just measured in graves and gold. It was measured in the psychological shadows that draped over California for generations. As the survivors integrated into the new society, a strange phenomenon began to occur. Many of the children who had survived the winter grew up to be unusually resilient, yet deeply marked by a hunger of the mind. Take Mary Murphy, for example. She had seen her mother perish and had endured the Forlorn Hope March. In California, she became a symbol of strength, but she never allowed a scrap of food to be wasted in her presence. If a guest left a crust of bread on their plate, Mary would tremble. To her, that crust wasn't just food. It was the difference between life and death. The trauma had rewired their very souls, creating a generation that lived in constant fear of the White Death returning. And then there were the stories of the rescuers who couldn't leave the mountain behind. Many of the men who had seen the cabins at the lake struggled with what we would now call PTSD. They had gone in as heroes, but they came out haunted by the blank stares of the starving children. One rescuer reportedly never spoke again, living out his days in the woods, as if the silence of the Sierras had followed him down to the valley and swallowed his voice. As the 20th century dawned, the Donner Party story underwent a transformation. It moved from a dark, whispered scandal to a foundational myth of the American West. In 1918, the Pioneers' Monument was finally dedicated at the site of the Breen cabin. At the ceremony, a few remaining descendants of the party stood in the shadow of the massive bronze statue. They looked up at the figure of the pioneer father, shielding his wife and child, looking toward the horizon. It was a sanitized version of the truth, one that focused on bravery rather than the gruesome reality of the hide boiling and the lottery of death. But the real monument isn't made of bronze. It's the highway that now cuts through the pass, Interstate 80. Every day, thousands of cars roar past the lake at 70 miles per hour. People talk on their phones, drink coffee, and complain about the traffic. They cross in 10 minutes what took the Donners 4 months to fail at. There is a profound irony in this. The very path that was a death trap is now a miracle of engineering. But sometimes, during a heavy winter storm, the highway is closed. The modern world grinds to a halt. In those moments, when the snow piles up and the wind begins to howl through the pines, the ghost of 1846 returns. The mountain reminds us that despite our technology and our speed, we are still small, and nature is still the ultimate judge. What is the final lesson of the Donner Party? Is it a warning against greed and ambition? Or is it a testament to the incredible lengths a mother will go to save her child? It is both. It is the story of James Reed's arrogance and his ultimate redemption through his desperate rescue attempts. It is the story of Tamsin Donner's loyalty, choosing to die with her husband rather than live without him. It is the story of the Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, who were the ultimate outsiders, sacrificed by the people they were trying to save, a dark reflection of the larger history of the West. As we close this chapter of history, we look back at the palace wagon, abandoned in the salt desert, the blood on the snow at Starved Camp, and the green valleys of California that finally received the survivors. They were ordinary people who walked into an extraordinary nightmare. They were us. The Donner Party reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, a fragile shell that we carry with us. When that shell breaks, what remains is the raw, pulsing heart of humanity, capable of both terrifying darkness and radiant, sacrificial light. Their journey ended long ago, but as long as the snow falls on the Sierra Nevada, the story of the Donner Party will never be forgotten. It is written in the wind, etched in the stone, and buried deep within the American soul. As the sun began to warm the peaks of the Sierra Nevada in the late spring of 1847, the physical evidence of the Donner Party began to emerge from the melting snow, like a skeleton being stripped of its shroud. But for the people of California, another kind of mystery was brewing: the mystery of the Donner Gold. Rumors had begun to circulate that the Donners and the Reeds had carried thousands of dollars in gold coins hidden in the false bottoms of their wagons. When the Fourth Relief arrived to find Louis Keseberg surrounded by human remains, they also found him clutching silk and gold. This sparked a decades-long obsession for treasure hunters. Even today, some believe that caches of pioneer gold are still buried near the Alder Creek campsites, protected by the unforgiving earth. But the real treasure was the stories, the oral histories passed down by the survivors. These stories began to diverge. Depending on who you asked, James Reed was either a murderer or a hero. Louis Keseberg was either a victim or a predator. The truth became as slippery as the mountain ice. The official history began to be written. But the survivors knew that the official version could never capture the smell of the cabins or the sound of a child asking for bread when there was only boiled leather. The psychological toll on the women of the Donner Party is a chapter of history that requires its own silence. In a time when Victorian values demanded that women be fragile and protected, the women of the Sierras proved to be the strongest of all. Statistically, more women survived the ordeal than men. Their bodies, perhaps naturally equipped with higher fat reserves, or their minds, fueled by a primal need to keep their children alive, held out longer against the cold. Margaret Reed, who had once lived in a mansion, spent the rest of her life in California as a pillar of her community. But she never liked the winter. Even a mild chill would make her retreat into her home and bolt the doors. She had seen what happens when the world turns white, and she never trusted the sky again. The Murphy family, who had lost so many, became central to the founding of Marysville, California. Mary Murphy, only a teenager when she crossed the pass, lived to see the city named after her flourish into a gold rush hub. Yet she reportedly never attended a public dinner. The act of eating in front of others, after what she had been forced to do to survive, was a vulnerability she could not endure. The shame, though undeserved, was a weight that even the sun of California could not melt.
As the decades rolled into the 20th century, the Donner Pass became more than a place. It became a symbol of the American spirit's breaking point. In 1946, on the 100th anniversary of the tragedy, a group of historians attempted to retrace the Hastings cutoff. They found that even with modern equipment and vehicles, the route was nearly impassable during certain times of the year. It was a final, chilling vindication for the pioneers. They hadn't been weak. They had been lied to. They had been led into a trap by a man who valued a book deal over human life. The story of the Donner Party concludes not with a period, but with an ellipsis. It remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of the shortcut, the idea that there is an easy way to greatness. Every time we look for a faster route, a quicker fix, or a path that avoids the hard work of the established trail, the ghost of James Reed stands there, warning us. Today, the lake is calm. The tourists take their photos and leave before dark. But if you linger as the moon rises over the granite peaks, you can almost see them. The long line of wagons, the weary oxen, and the faces of 87 dreamers who just wanted a better life. They remind us that the road to the future is often paved with the bones of those who went before us, and that the greatest tragedy isn't dying, it's being forgotten.
The survivors had reached the end of their physical journey, but for many, the Donner name was a heavy chain they would drag for the rest of their lives. In the late 1800s, as the world moved into the industrial age, the story of the Donner Party began to transition from news to legend. But for the descendants, the scars remained literal. Patrick Breen, who had kept that hauntingly calm diary during the winter, saw his sons grow up to be successful ranchers and businessmen. The Breens were unique. They were the only family to survive almost entirely intact. Some said it was their faith. Others said it was the sturdy cabin they occupied. But even they lived under a cloud of suspicion. Rumors persisted that they had hoarded food while others starved. In the small towns of early California, memories were long, and forgiveness was a rare currency. The Reed family, perhaps the most famous of the survivors, found a strange kind of peace. James Reed, the man whose temper had sparked the banishment and whose determination had fueled the rescue, lived to be an old man. He died in 1874, a wealthy and respected citizen of San Jose. On his deathbed, he supposedly spoke not of the gold he had made, but of the white silence of the mountains. He had spent 30 years trying to outrun the ghost of the man he killed in the desert, and the ghosts of those he couldn't save from the snow. While the human survivors faded away, the geography of the tragedy became a site of national reflection. In the early 20th century, the state of California recognized that the Donner Lake site was not just a graveyard, but a monument to the pioneer spirit. When workers began constructing the foundation for the Pioneer Monument, they dug deep into the soil. They found more than just artifacts.
They found the hearthstones of the Breen cabin. These stones were scorched by the very fires that had kept the children warm while the world outside turned to ice. It was a visceral connection to the past. The monument itself, dedicated in 1918, features a bronze family group. The father looks ahead with resolve, while the mother clutches a child. It represents the American ideal, but those who know the true story see the hidden layers. They see Tamsin Donner's sacrifice, the desperation of the forlorn hope, and the two Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, who were murdered so that others might eat. The monument is as much about what is omitted as what is shown. It is a symbol of how a nation chooses to remember its darkest hours by turning them into stories of heroism.
In the modern era, the Donner Party has become a staple of American Gothic history. But beyond the horror and the sensationalism, the story serves as a profound psychological study. Scientists and historians still debate the what-ifs. What if they had waited just one more day in Springfield? What if Lansford Hastings had never written his book? What if they had ignored the shortcut and stayed on the established trail? The answer is a chilling reminder of human nature. We are a species of risk-takers. The same ambition that led the Donners to their doom is the same ambition that put a man on the moon and built the cities we live in today. The line between a visionary and a fool is often just a matter of the weather. As the final words of this narrative are spoken, imagine the Sierra Nevada mountains tonight. The wind still whistles through the same pine trees. The lake still reflects the same stars that the starving pioneers looked at in prayer. Their story is a mirror held up to ourselves. It tells us that we are capable of unimaginable suffering, terrifying choices, and incredible endurance. The Donner Party did not just leave behind a trail of grief, they left behind a legacy of survival. They taught us that even in the deepest winter, the human will to see the spring is the most powerful force on Earth. Their journey is over, but their echoes remain, a haunting, beautiful, and eternal part of the American story.
The rescue was not a single moment of triumph, but a slow, agonizing process of filtration. For the children of the Donner Party, the transition from the white hell to the blooming spring of California was jarring. Many of them, like young Patty Reed, kept small mementos hidden in their clothes, dolls made of rags or smooth stones from the lake, as if they couldn't quite believe they were allowed to own anything beautiful again. The state of California was in its infancy, a wild territory of gold seekers and adventurers. In this chaotic environment, the Donner survivors were often treated like curiosities in a sideshow. People would point at them in the streets of San Francisco, whispering, "There goes one of them." This public scrutiny created a fortress of silence. The survivors began to marry into other pioneer families, creating a network of people who understood the unspoken. They didn't need to explain why they always kept their pantries overflowing, or why they couldn't stand the sound of a whistling wind. They were a tribe bound by a trauma that the rest of the world could only imagine through sensationalist newspaper headlines. For them, the American dream was simply a warm bed and a full plate, things the rest of the world took for granted. One of the most tragic and least discussed aspects of the Donner Party is the fate of the forlorn hope survivors. Out of the 15 who set out on that desperate snowshoe trek, only 7 reached safety. Among the dead were the 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvador. For years, history ignored their names, but their story is a haunting reflection of the era. They had risked their lives to bring food to strangers, only to be hunted like animals when those strangers turned to madness. In recent years, historians have sought to honor them, recognizing that the sacrifice of the Donner Party was not always voluntary. This brings us to a dark realization. The tragedy was not just a battle against nature, but a breakdown of the social contract. In the cabins, as the weeks turned into months, the hierarchy of civilization collapsed. Money became worthless. A silver coin couldn't buy a single calorie. Social status evaporated. The wealthy Reeds were just as hungry as the hired teamsters. In that absolute equality of suffering, the true character of each individual was laid bare. Some became monsters, yes, but others became saints, giving their last morsel of hide to a crying child who wasn't even their own. As we look at the maps today, the Hastings Cutoff is marked as a historical curiosity, but it serves as a permanent monument to the danger of the ego. Lansford Hastings, the man who wrote the guide, was never legally punished. He didn't lose his life or his reputation in his own time. He even went on to try and establish a new colony in South America after the Civil War. Another failure. His story is the necessary shadow to the Donner Light. It reminds us that for every pioneer who struggles with an axe and a plow, there is often a man with a pen and a map, promising a shortcut that doesn't exist. The Donner Party died for another man's ambition. In the final analysis, the story of the Donner Party is a story of edges. The edge of the continent, the edge of endurance, and the edge of what a human being can tolerate before they break. They reached the edge of the world and looked into the abyss. And though the abyss looked back, 47 of them had the strength to blink. They walked out of the mountains and into history, leaving us with a question that echoes through every winter. If it were you, if the fire went out and the food was gone, who would you become? As the decades turned into a new century, the site of the Donner Party's encampment was slowly reclaimed by the earth. For a long time, the world relied on the shaky memories of traumatized survivors and the sensationalist headlines of 19th century newspapers. But in the 1980s and 90s, a new generation of detectives, forensic archaeologists, returned to the Sierra Nevada with tools the pioneers could never have imagined. They didn't just dig for bones, they dug for the truth. Using ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis of the soil, they located the exact hearth of the Alder Creek camp. What they found was a heartbreaking mosaic of human desperation. They discovered thousands of tiny, calcified bone fragments. When these were put under the microscope, the analysis revealed a chilling story. The pioneers hadn't just eaten oxen or horses. The fragments showed evidence of pot polish, smooth edges on the bone that occur when they are boiled for hours in a desperate attempt to extract every last bit of fat and marrow. But more importantly, the test showed that many of these bones were from dogs, rodents, and even deer. This suggests that for a significant period, the families tried desperately to hunt anything that moved in that frozen wasteland, before the ultimate taboo became their only choice. It paints a picture not of monsters, but of people clinging to their humanity with everything they had. But the archaeology of the site revealed something even more intimate. Among the charred remains of the fires, researchers found small, everyday objects that tell a story of love and hope amidst the horror. They found a small piece of a writing slate, a tiny fragment of a porcelain doll's head, and a brass thimble. Think about that scene for a moment. Outside, the snow is 20 feet deep. Inside, a dark, smoke-filled cabin, a mother is trying to teach her child to write or encouraging a young girl to play with her doll. Even as their bodies were wasting away, they were trying to maintain the structures of a normal life. They were trying to ensure that if they did survive, their children wouldn't just be survivors. They would still be civilized. This resilience is the heartbeat of the Donner story. We often focus on the cannibalism because it is shocking, but the true shock is the endurance of the human spirit. The fact that Tamsin Donner, while her husband's body was literally rotting from gangrene, still took the time to pack her botanical sketches
and her children's school books into a trunk. She was looking toward a future she would never see, planting seeds of knowledge in a place where nothing could grow.
The legal and social fallout of the Donner Party also created a lasting impact on American law. The case of Louis Keseberg became a landmark in the study of survival crime. Can a person be held responsible for what they do when faced with certain death? Keseberg was never convicted of murder, but he was convicted in the court of public opinion. His life became a tragedy of isolation. He once told a visitor that he felt like a man who had died in the mountains, but whose body kept walking. He represented the dark mirror of the pioneer experience, the man who did what was necessary to live, only to find that life was no longer worth living because of the cost. This leads us to the final resting places of the survivors. If you visit the cemeteries of Northern California today, you will find the graves of the Donners, the Reeds, the Breens, and the Murphys scattered across the landscape. They died as farmers, shopkeepers, and grandmothers, but their headstones rarely mention the winter of 1846. It's as if they collectively agreed that the mountains were a separate lifetime, a dark dream from which they had finally woken. But the mountains remember. Every year, when the first snow falls on the Donner Pass, the silence returns. A silence that holds the weight of 87 souls and the echoes of a journey that defined the edge of the human soul. The mountains had finally released their grip, but the society that awaited the survivors was often as cold as the snow they had left behind. As the stories of what happened at Truckee Lake began to circulate, an invisible wall was built around the survivors. Yet life in the mid-19th century American West demanded resilience. The Reed family, perhaps the most controversial at the start, became one of the most successful. James Reed, the man who was banished and then returned as a savior, did not just hide in his success. He became a key figure in the development of San Jose. But there was a ritual in the Reed household that spoke volumes. Every year, on the anniversary of their rescue, they would gather in silence. They didn't feast. They remembered the taste of the wind. His daughter, Patty Reed, who had hidden a tiny wooden doll in her dress throughout the entire ordeal, a doll that never left her side even when she was eating hide, grew up to be a woman of incredible poise. That doll is now preserved in a museum, its sightless eyes having witnessed things no child should ever see. The Breens, on the other hand, chose the path of quiet devotion. They settled in the hills of San Juan Bautista. Patrick Breen, whose diary provided the world with the most chillingly accurate account of the winter, never sought fame from his writings. He used his wealth to build a ranch that became a sanctuary for other travelers. It was as if by feeding others, he was trying to fill the eternal void that the winter of '46 had carved into his spirit. They were the only family to survive without losing a single member, a fact many attributed to a miracle, though the pragmatists pointed to their sturdy cabin and iron discipline.
But what of the children who lost everything? The Donner orphans, the daughters of George and Tamsin, found themselves in a world where their name was a burden. Eliza, Georgia, and Frances Donner were split up and raised by different families. Eliza Donner Houghton's life became a quest for justice. As she grew older, she realized that the history books were painting her mother as a victim and her father as a failure. She spent her adult life writing letters, interviewing survivors, and eventually publishing her own book. She wanted the world to know that Tamsin Donner was a woman of science and soul, not just a tragic footnote. Through Eliza's efforts, the narrative shifted. The Donner Party was no longer just a story of cannibalism. It was a story of a mother's ultimate sacrifice. Eliza proved that the pen could be as powerful as the pioneer's axe in carving out a place in history. Meanwhile, the landscape was changing. The very trail they had died on was being paved over. The gold rush brought hundreds of thousands of people through the pass. Most of them didn't know they were walking over the graves of the pioneers, but some did. There are accounts of miners stopping at the lake, taking off their hats, and standing in silence for a moment,
before moving on toward the goldfields. The Donner Party had become the saints of the trail, a warning and an inspiration for all who dared to chase the sun. The final mystery that modern historians have puzzled over is the fate of the lost wagons. Deep in the Great Salt Lake Desert, where the Reeds were forced to abandon their palace wagon, the shifting sands still occasionally reveal pieces of the past. In the late 20th century, researchers found the wheel ruts of the Donner Party still visible in the salt crust after 150 years. They found fragments of fine porcelain, a silver spoon, and the heavy chains of the oxen. These objects, frozen in time, tell the story of the moment the dream began to die. They represent the weight of civilization that the pioneers tried to carry into the wilderness, only to realize that the wilderness demands you leave everything behind, except your soul. As we look back from the 21st century, the Donner Party stands as the ultimate American epic. It has everything: ambition, betrayal, tragedy, and a survival so miraculous it borders on the impossible. They are the ghosts that haunt the Sierra Nevada, but they are also the pioneers who paved the way. Their journey teaches us that even when the map is wrong, even when the shortcut is a lie, the human heart has a compass that always points toward home, even if that home is in the next life. The story of the Donner Party is now complete in our telling, but it will never be finished. Every winter, the snow falls, the wind howls, and the mountains whisper their names. George, Tamsin, James, Margaret, Patty, they are all still there, waiting for the spring.
The rescue of the Donner Party was not a single event. It was a series of 4 frantic, heartbreaking relief efforts. While we often focus on the survivors, the men of the relief parties were the unsung heroes of the Sierra Nevada. These were men who had nothing to gain. No gold, no land, only the slim chance of saving strangers. One such man was Salim Woodworth, a naval officer whose leadership was often questioned, but whose resources were vital. However, the true strength lay in the mountain men. These men moved through the snow like ghosts. They didn't have modern winter gear. They had heavy wool, animal furs, and an iron will. They climbed peaks that even today's professional climbers find daunting, all while carrying 50-pound packs of flour and dried beef on their backs. When they reached the cabins, the rescuers were often so traumatized by what they saw that they broke down in tears. Imagine the scene. These hardened frontiersmen, who had fought bears and survived desert droughts, sobbing at the sight of a child's skeletal hand reaching out from a hole in the snow. They were forced to play God, deciding who could survive the trek back and who was too far gone. It was a burden that many of these rescuers carried to their own graves, wondering if they had made the right choices in the heat of a frozen hell. Among the rescuers, the name John Stark stands as a giant. During the second relief, a group of survivors, mostly children and the elderly, had been left behind at a place called Starved Camp because a storm made it impossible to carry them. They were expected to die. When Stark arrived with the third relief, the other rescuers argued that they could only save a couple of the strongest children. Stark looked at the huddle of 9 starving souls and shook his head. "I will not leave a single one," he declared. What followed was one of the greatest feats of human endurance in history. Stark, a massive man of 220 pounds, would pick up 2 children, carry them forward through the waist-deep snow for a few hundred yards, set them down, and then trek back for the next 2. He did this for days. He joked with them, he told them stories of the warm valleys, and he shared his own meager rations. By the time they reached the safety of the base camp, Stark was nearly blind from snow blindness, and his legs were raw, but all 9 were alive. His story is the perfect antidote to the darkness of the Donner Party. It proves that for every act of desperation, there was an act of divine bravery. The final chapter of the rescue belonged to the fourth relief, the one that found the infamous Louis Keseberg. By April 1847, The camps were no longer places of life. The snow was melting, revealing the true scale of the horror. The rescuers who entered the Breen cabin found it filled with the debris of a nightmare. This last rescue party was less of a mission of mercy and more of a mission of recovery. They were there to find any remaining survivors, but also to secure the property and records of the deceased. It was during this time that the tension between the civilized world of California and the primal world of the mountain reached its peak. The rescuers treated Keseberg with open contempt, nearly hanging him on the spot when they suspected him of murder. This conflict highlights the ultimate tragedy of the Donner Party, the inability of those who stayed warm to understand those who were frozen. The survivors were brought down from the mountains and expected to rejoin society as if they hadn't seen the world end. But as the last wagon of the Fourth Relief rolled away from the lake, the Donner Trail was officially closed. The story now belonged to the historians, the poets, and the ghosts of the Sierra Nevada.
The mountains had finally released their grip, but the society that awaited the survivors was often as cold as the snow they had left behind. As the stories of what happened at Truckee Lake began to circulate, an invisible wall was built around the survivors. Yet, life in the mid-19th century American West demanded resilience. The Reed family, perhaps the most controversial at the start, became one of the most successful. James Reed, the man who was banished and then returned as a savior, did not just hide in his success. He became a key figure in the development of San Jose. But there was a ritual in the Reed household that spoke volumes. Every year, on the anniversary of their rescue, they would gather in silence. They didn't feast. They remembered the taste of the wind. His daughter, Patty Reed, who had hidden a tiny wooden doll in her dress throughout the entire ordeal, a doll that never left her side even when she was eating oxhide, grew up to be a woman of incredible poise. That doll is now preserved in a museum in Sacramento, its sightless glass eyes having witnessed things no child should ever see. For Patty, the doll wasn't just a toy, it was a witness to her survival, a piece of her soul that refused to freeze. In the years following the tragedy, the Donner name became a ghost that haunted the halls of American westward expansion. But for the daughters of George and Tamsen Donner, the mission was different. They were orphans in a land their parents had died to reach. Eliza Donner Houghton, only 4 years old during the winter of 1846, grew up to be the family's fiercest protector. In an era when the Donner Party was discussed only in whispers or sensationalist tabloids, Eliza took up the pen. She realized that history was being written by people who weren't there, people who focused on the hunger but forgot the love. She interviewed every survivor she could find, cross-referencing their fading memories to build a definitive account. Her book, The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate, published decades later, changed everything. It humanized the victims. It spoke of Tamsen's botanical collections and George's kindness. Because of Eliza, the world stopped seeing the Donners as monsters and started seeing them as pioneers who were simply, tragically, unlucky. She turned a story of death into a testament of family loyalty. As we look at the Donner Pass today, the high-speed trains of the Union Pacific and the thousands of cars on Interstate 80 create a constant hum of modern life. But the geography remains unchanged. The granite peaks still loom, and the lake still sits in its deep blue silence. The legacy of the Donner Party is not found in the bones or the rusted wagon wheels, but in the lessons of the human spirit. It serves as a stark reminder of the cost of the American dream. It tells us that progress often demands a sacrifice, and that the line between civilization and the primal is much thinner than we care to admit. Every year, when the first heavy snow hits the Sierras, local residents still feel a sense of unease. They look up at the pass, and remember the 87 who walked into the white void. The Donner Party is our ultimate survival story, a mirror that asks us who we would be if everything were stripped away. They were families, they were dreamers, and in the end, they were survivors. Their journey didn't end in the snow. It lives on every time we tell their story, ensuring that the fire they tried so hard to keep burning never truly goes out. As the survivors began their new lives in California, a silent war was being fought within their own minds. This was the era before psychology had words for trauma or post-traumatic stress, yet the survivors were its living embodiments. In the small settlements of the Sacramento Valley, the Donner Party members were often found staring blankly at the horizon, their bodies present, but their spirits still trapped in the snow-choked cabins of the high Sierras. One of the most haunting stories is that of William Eddy. Eddy was a man who had lost everything. His wife, Eleanor, and his 2 children had perished in the mountains. He was one of the few who had successfully made it out with the forlorn hope. For the rest of his life, Eddy was a man fueled by a quiet, burning intensity. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he couldn't escape the grief. It was said that he could never again bear to hear a child cry. The sound would send him into a state of visible trembling, as it echoed the final weak whimpers of his own children in the dark. His survival was a burden, a survivor's guilt that was common among the group. They had lived while those they loved had died, often by consuming the very people they had set out to protect. This psychological weight created a code of the survivors, a pact of mutual support where they looked after each other's children, knowing that no one else in the world could truly understand the price they had paid for their lives. Beyond the personal tragedies, the Donner Party incident had a profound effect on the business of the West. Before 1846, the trail was seen as a path to guaranteed riches. After 1846, it was seen as a gamble with the devil. The news of the disaster actually slowed migration for a couple of years, as families back east reconsidered the risks of the overland journey. However, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848 changed everything. Suddenly, the trail was flooded again, but this time, the travelers were different. They were 49ers, mostly single men, better equipped and more desperate for wealth. They passed the ruins of the Donner cabins with a mix of fear and curiosity. Some would stop to bury the remains that the wolves and the weather had uncovered, a grim task that became a rite of passage for many young miners heading to the goldfields. The Donner tragedy forced the early California government to establish more way stations and rescue outposts. The tragedy, in a sense, civilized the trail. It taught the nation that the wilderness could not be conquered by individual families alone. It required a collective effort, better communication, and most importantly, honest maps. The Hastings Cutoff became a permanent lesson in the archives of American history. The shortest path is often the deadliest. As we near the final chapters of this epic, we must look at the legacy of the land. Today, the area around Donner Lake is one of the most beautiful and sought-after locations in the American West. There are luxury cabins, ski resorts, and hiking trails where people spend thousands of dollars to enjoy the winter wonderland. But beneath the layer of modern recreation lies the layer of history. Local legends still persist of the Lady in White, seen wandering near the Alder Creek site during heavy blizzards. Some believe it is the spirit of Tamsin Donner, still searching for her children in the snow. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the atmosphere of the pass is undeniable. There is a weight to the air, a stillness that feels different from the surrounding mountains. The Donner Party reminds us that we are all just a few days of hunger away from our primal selves. They were not them. They were us. They had the same dreams, the same fears, and the same love for their families. Their story is the ultimate human drama, played out on a stage of ice and granite. It is a story that ends not with a period, but with a question that lingers in the heart of every listener. In the the dead of winter, when the fire is gone and the world is white? What would you do to see the sun again?
The survivors of the Donner Party eventually became the elders of a new California, but their silence was often more vocal than their words. In the late 1800s, as the frontier was officially declared closed, the survivors found themselves as living relics of a bygone era. They were the bridge between the wild, untamed West and the civilized industrial state California was becoming. Virginia Reed, who had been a young girl when she survived the snow, became one of the most prolific writers among the survivors. Her letters to her family back east are now considered some of the most precious documents of American history. In one of her final writings, she reflected on the nature of their survival. She didn't speak of the hunger or the cold, she spoke of the light. She described how, in the darkest nights in the cabins, the families would tell stories of the futures they would have, the orchards they would plant, the schools their children would attend. This, perhaps, was their true secret. They didn't survive just because they ate. They survived because they refused to stop dreaming. Their physical bodies were trapped in 20 feet of snow, but their minds were already in the sun-drenched valleys of San Jose. This psychological resilience, the ability to look past the immediate horror toward a hopeful horizon, is what truly separates the Donner Party from a mere tragedy. It turns it into a masterclass in human endurance. The Donner Lake we see today, with its serene waters and surrounding pine forests, holds its secrets well, but for the descendants of the party, the lake is a sacred space. Every few years, descendants from all over the world gather at the Pioneer Monument. They represent a wide array of professions: doctors, lawyers, teachers, and farmers. They are the living proof that the Donner Party did not fail. Their presence is a direct answer to the mountains. The Sierra Nevada tried to end their bloodlines in the winter of 1846, but today there are thousands of people who carry the DNA of the Reeds, the Breens, the Murphys, and the Donners. Each of these lives is a victory over the blizzard. In recent years, the story has even reached the world of art and literature, inspiring countless books, movies, and even operas. Why does it haunt us so much? Perhaps because it is the ultimate what-if scenario. It strips away the comforts of modern life and asks us to look into the dark. It challenges our morality and our strength. The Donner Party has become a modern myth, a cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the terrifying indifference of nature. But above all, it is a story of the mother's heart, the sacrificial love that saw Tamsin Donner stay behind, knowing she would never leave those mountains alive. As we bring this long and harrowing journey to a close, we must remember the final image of the Donner Party, not as skeletons in the snow, but as pioneers in the sun. The wagons that once stood stalled at the pass eventually gave way to the iron rails of the Transcontinental Railroad, and later the smooth asphalt of the interstate. The shortcut that took so many lives is now a journey of a few minutes. But the lessons remain. The Donner Party teaches us that civilization is a collective effort. We survive not by our own strength alone, but by the strength of the community we build. They failed when they turned against each other in the desert, and they survived when they looked after the orphans in the cabins. The story of the Donner Party is the story of America itself, a relentless push toward the horizon, filled with grave mistakes and incredible triumphs. As the stars come out over the Sierra Nevada tonight, they shine on a land that was bought with a terrible price. The 87 pioneers who set out from Springfield in 1846 didn't all reach their destination, but they all reached immortality. Their names are written in the wind, their courage is etched in the granite, and their story will be told as long as there is snow on the mountains and hope in the human heart.
While the leaders like Reed and Donner are etched in bronze, the true silent backbone of the caravan were the teamsters, the hired hands who drove the oxen and guarded the supplies. Men like Charles Stanton, a bachelor from Chicago who had no family in the party, but who became perhaps its greatest martyr. Stanton was a man of small stature but immense spirit. When the party first ran low on supplies in the Nevada desert, it was Stanton who volunteered to ride ahead to California to bring back help. He didn't have to return. He reached the safety of Sutter Fort, his pockets full of food and his future secure. But he looked back at the mountains and remembered the children he had left behind. He rode back into the jaws of the winter with 2 Native American guides and several mules loaded with flour. When the forlorn hope was eventually forced to make their desperate trek, a blinding snow blindness struck Stanton. He sat down by a tree, lit his pipe, and told the others to go on. "I am coming soon," he said, with a calm that defied the horror of his situation. He was found months later, his pipe still near his skeletal hand, a silent witness to the fact that sometimes the greatest courage is not in surviving, but in returning to help those who cannot help themselves.
The cultural memory of the Donner Party is often focused on the act of cannibalism, but for the survivors, the most enduring trauma was the betrayal of the map. Years after they settled in California, several survivors attempted to track down Lansford Hastings, the man who had authored The Emigrant's Guide. There was a simmering rage that never truly cooled. They realized that their suffering wasn't just a result of a harsh winter, but of a calculated marketing lie. In the 1850s, a legal discussion began among some of the wealthier survivors about whether they could sue for damages. However, the American frontier had no such precedents. This sense of injustice led to a peculiar tradition among the survivors' families, a deep skepticism of experts and authority figures. They taught their children that a printed word on a map was no substitute for the word of a man who had actually walked the ground. This cultural shift, born in the snow of the Sierras, eventually influenced the rugged, self-reliant Californian identity, a belief that survival depends on your own eyes and your own hands, rather than the promises of those who live in safety.
As we move toward the final deep dive of this epic, we must consider the cabin of the Breens. While most of the shelters were temporary huts of hide and kine, the Breen cabin was a solid structure of logs. It became the City Hall of the Suffering. Inside its cramped, dark walls, the most difficult decisions were made. Patrick Breen's diary, written on scraps of paper by the dim light of a flickering fire, reveals the slow erosion of time. He stopped writing about dreams and started writing about weather and death with a clinical coldness. Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. It is distressing. This cabin remains the focal point of archaeological study. Even 180 years later, the soil beneath where the Breen hearth once stood contains a higher concentration of calcium and phosphate, chemical ghosts of the bones that were boiled there. It stands as a reminder that history isn't just in the books, it is in the very chemistry of the earth. The cabin was eventually burned by rescuers to stop the spread of disease, but its location remains the most visited spot in the Donner Memorial State Park, a place where modern travelers stand in silence, trying to imagine 87 people sharing a space no larger than a modern living room, while the world outside turned into a white tomb.
While the struggle between man and nature was the central theme at the lake camp, there was an even darker tragedy unfolding: the story of Luis and Salvador. These 2 young Miwok men had been sent by John Sutter from California to bring food to the stranded pioneers. They were outsiders, men of the land who knew the mountains better than any of the emigrants. Yet they became the ultimate victims of a culture they were trying to save. When the Forlorn Hope group reached the peak of their starvation, Luis and Salvador refused to participate in the cannibalism of the others. They stood apart, silent observers of a descent into madness they could not reconcile with their own beliefs. However, as the group grew more desperate, the guides realized they were no longer seen as rescuers, but as prey. One night, sensing the predatory shift in the camp, they fled into the frozen forest. They were tracked down, not by animals, but by the very men they had brought flour to weeks before. Their end was a grim testament to the breakdown of all human codes. In the modern history of California, Luis and Salvador have finally been recognized not as footnotes, but as martyrs. Their sacrifice remains a haunting reminder that in the face of absolute survival, the first thing to perish is often gratitude.
As death became a constant companion in the cabins, a strange, macabre formality took hold. People began to write their final wills on scraps of fabric, the margins of Bibles, or even carved into the wood of the wagons. These were not documents for lawyers. They were messages to a future they feared would never come. Tamsin Donner, the schoolteacher whose intellect never wavered, reportedly kept a meticulous log of her family's belongings and her botanical observations until her hands were too frozen to hold a quill. She was obsessed with the idea that their journey should have a legacy. She didn't want them to be remembered as a group of starving people, but as a family of scholars and pioneers. In the Reed cabin, Margaret Reed kept her children focused on the after. She would describe the house they would build in California, the color of the curtains, the smell of the kitchen, the sound of the nearby creek. This mental architecture was their shield. They were building their future homes in their minds, while their physical bodies were being buried by the Sierra snow. This ability to live in two worlds at once, the horrific present and the beautiful imagined future, is perhaps the most profound psychological survival strategy discovered in the history of the Donner Party. The great silence followed the rescue. Once the survivors reached the warm air of the valleys, a strange phenomenon occurred. Many of them found they could no longer tolerate silence. The absolute, crushing quiet of the mountain winter had become a symbol of death. In the bustling towns of the gold rush, survivors were often found in the loudest places, taverns, markets, or near busy construction sites. But for the children, the legacy was different. They became the sentinels of history. As they grew into old age, they realized that if they didn't speak, the truth would be buried with them. In the late 1890s, Virginia Reed wrote a memoir that stripped away the sensationalism. She spoke of the small mercies, the way a brother would hold his sister's hand to share a tiny bit of warmth, or how a father would tell a joke while his own heart was failing. These stories shifted the focus from the act of eating to the act of loving. The Donner Party became a study in the endurance of affection. It proved that even when the body is reduced to its most primal needs, the heart can still function with a sophistication that defies biological explanation. The survivors didn't just carry the weight of the dead, they carried the light of those who had died so that they might live. In the grim hierarchy of the Donner Party, there were those whose names were etched in history by bloodline. And then there were the silent anchors, the Teamsters. Milt Elliott was one such man. A hired hand for the Reed family, he was bound by no blood, yet he possessed a loyalty that transcended the biological drive for self-preservation. When James Reed was cast out into the desert, he left Milt with a singular, heavy charge: protect my family. In the suffocating darkness of the cabins, Milt became a phantom of industry. Even as his own ribs began to protrude and his strength waned, he was the one who crawled through the snow to scavenge for frozen wood. He gave the largest portions of his meager hide soup to the Reed children, watching with hollow eyes as they swallowed the gray, gelatinous mass. His death in February
was a crushing blow to the morale of the lake camp. Margaret Reed wept for him not as a servant, but as a brother. Milt Elliott's story serves as a profound counter-narrative to the darkness. It proves that in the total collapse of civilization, the concept of duty can remain a flickering candle in the wind, refusing to go out until the very last breath.
To understand the scale of the tragedy, one must understand the adversary, the Sierra Nevada winter of 1846. Modern climatologists, using tree ring data and historical weather modeling, have identified that year as an anomalous event, a perfect storm triggered by a severe El Niño cycle. The pioneers didn't just face a cold winter, they faced a once-in-a-century atmospheric assault. The snow didn't just fall, it descended in suffocating curtains, sometimes dropping 5 feet in a single 24-hour period. Inside the cabins, the pressure of the snow against the walls created an eerie, groaning silence. The air became thin and foul, saturated with the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies. When the pioneers attempted to dig their way out, they found themselves in a labyrinth of white, where the horizon vanished and the sky merged with the ground. This wasn't just weather, it was a physical weight that pressed down on their chests, a reminder that the mountains were not a passive backdrop to their journey, but an active, predatory force that had decided to reclaim the land they were trying to cross. The psychological transition from pioneer to survivor began long before the rescue parties arrived. It started with the erosion of the senses. In the cabins, time lost its linearity. Days were marked not by the sun, which was rarely seen through the blizzards, but by the dwindling supply of ox hides. The mind, starved of protein and light, began to play tricks. Some survivors reported hearing the sounds of phantom bells or the voices of relatives back in Illinois, calling to them from the snowdrifts. This sensory deprivation led to a state of Arctic hysteria, where the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. Men who were once pillars of their communities found themselves arguing with shadows or staring at a single spot on the wall for hours. Yet within this mental decay, there were flashes of startling clarity. Mothers would invent elaborate games for their children, using buttons and pebbles to simulate a world that no longer existed. This internal struggle, the fight to keep the mind from fracturing while the body was literally consuming itself, is the silent epic within the larger story of the Donner Party. It was a war fought in the quiet corners of the soul, where the only prize was the sanity required to see the next sunrise. The arrival of the first relief did not bring immediate joy. It brought a terrifying new reality: the choice. The rescuers, exhausted and carrying limited supplies, could not take everyone. For the first time, the pioneers had to look at their own families and decide who was viable. This was a Darwinian nightmare disguised as a rescue. Mothers had to choose which of their children were strong enough to walk through 30 miles of waist-deep snow and which had to be left behind in the dark cabins, praying for a second rescue. The screams of the children left behind echoed off the granite walls of the pass, a sound that the rescuers later said haunted them more than the sight of the dead. This moment shattered the last remnants of the pioneer spirit. They were no longer a party moving toward a goal. They were fragments of humanity, scattered by a wind that cared nothing for their names or their dreams. The walkout was a procession of ghosts, each step a testament to the agony of those who were saved and the silent despair of those who were left in the White Tomb. As the survivors finally reached the lowlands of California, they were met with a world that was rapidly changing. The Mexican-American War was raging, and the territory was in a state of flux. The survivors, emaciated and traumatized, were thrust into a society that viewed them with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound revulsion.
The rumors of cannibalism had outrun the rescue parties, and the survivors found themselves celebrities of the macabre. Public trials, both in the newspapers and in the town squares, began almost immediately. Every detail of their survival was dissected by people who had never missed a meal. This social second winter was in some ways as harsh as the first. The survivors had to defend their honor against a public that wanted to turn their tragedy into a morality play. They were forced to build new lives while their old lives were being sensationalized for the entertainment of the masses. This pressure forced many into a pact of silence that would last for generations, a collective burying of the truth that only added to the weight of the secrets they carried in their hearts.
The final mystery of the Donner Party is the missing souls, those who were never accounted for, whose remains were never found by the relief parties or later archaeologists. Some believe that in the final, desperate days, a few individuals wandered off into the woods, driven mad by hunger, and simply vanished into the vastness of the Sierras. These missing pieces of the puzzle ensure that the story of the Donner Party will never truly be closed. Every few years, a hiker or a researcher finds a rusted tool or a fragment of bone that reopens the case. The mountains hold these secrets close, guarding the truth of what happened in those final dark hours at Alder Creek and the lake camp. The story remains a living thing, a narrative that continues to evolve as new evidence emerges from the melting snow. It is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates, but a series of unanswered questions that continue to vibrate through the decades, calling to us from the high peaks where the wind never stops whispering. As the survivors began to integrate into the burgeoning economy of California, a strange phenomenon occurred. They became the unintended architects of the New West's infrastructure. James Reed, specifically, used his harrowing experience with the terrain to help advise on the safest routes for the first established roads in the San Jose area. He understood, better than any surveyor, how the wind carved the snow and how the spring runoff turned firm ground into a marshy trap. This transformation of tragedy into utility was a form of silent penance. For Reed and others, building the road meant ensuring that no future family would find themselves stranded where a map promised a path. The economic legacy of the Donner Party wasn't just in the gold they lost, but in the hard-won wisdom they provided to a state that was about to experience the greatest migration in human history. They were the warning label on the bottle of the American dream, and their presence in the early California legislature and business circles ensured that the chaos of the trail was replaced by a rigid, survival-oriented order. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Donner Party is the logistics of death, the grim reality of managing a campsite where the dead outnumbered the living. In the Breen and Murphy cabins, the floors were eventually raised by layers of dirt and hide to cover those who had passed during the night. The survivors were living on top of their own history, a physical layering of grief that grew as the winter deepened. Modern forensic analysis of these floor layers has revealed a startling amount of organization amidst the despair. They didn't just give up. They created zones for fire, zones for sleeping, and zones for the departed. This grim domesticity shows that even when the human mind is pushed to the edge of insanity, the instinct to organize and categorize remains. It was this structure, this refusal to descend into total animalistic chaos, that allowed 47 people to walk out of that canyon. They kept house until the very end, proving that civilization isn't built of bricks and mortar, but of the rules we follow when everything else has been stripped away. As the mid-1800s transitioned into the late Victorian era, the Donner Party survivors found themselves at the center of a burgeoning literary genre, the frontier Gothic. Writers from the East Coast began to fictionalize their struggle, often adding supernatural elements, ghosts in the snow, or curses placed upon the families. This commodification of their suffering was a bitter pill for the aging survivors to swallow. Virginia Reed,
now a grandmother, became the unofficial gatekeeper of the party's dignity. She spent her final years answering letters from strangers, gently correcting the monstrous lies published in cheap dime novels. She insisted that the story wasn't about the meat, but about the spirit. In her final documented interview, she was asked if she still hated the mountains. She looked out toward the horizon and replied, "You cannot hate the hand of God, even when it is cold. You can only wonder why you were chosen to feel its chill and still live to tell of it." Her words helped transition the Donner story from a tabloid scandal into a foundational American epic of endurance. The environmental impact of the Donner encampment left a scar of silence on the Truckee Lake region that lasted for nearly half a century. Local Washoe tribes, who had watched the tragedy from a distance, reportedly avoided the area for decades, believing the ground had been tainted by a hunger that never leaves. They had attempted to leave food for the pioneers early on, but the sight of the starving white men had terrified them. They saw a desperation they didn't recognize as human. This cultural intersection is a vital part of the story. It highlights the difference between those who lived with the land and those who tried to conquer it. The Donners were trying to force a lifestyle, complete with fine china and heavy wagons, upon a landscape that only permitted the leanest of existences. The Donner scar eventually healed as the tourism of the 20th century took over. But if you look at the old-growth trees near the lake, there is a gap in the forest canopy that still marks where the pioneers felled the timber to build their tombs. Nature, it seems, has a much longer memory than man. In the final accounting of the Donner Party, we must look at the mathematics of mercy. 47 survived, but the distribution was telling. Almost all the children who were over the age of 6 survived, while the elderly and the very young perished. This tells us that the survival was not random. It was a collective effort of the middle-aged to protect the next generation. The Donner Party was a failure of leadership, a failure of mapping, and a failure of timing. But it was a supreme triumph of the parental instinct. As we reach the conclusion of this 100,000-word journey, we realize that the story is not a circle, but a spiral. It returns to the same themes of hunger and cold, but each time it reveals a new layer of human complexity. The pioneers of 1846 are gone, but they remain the ultimate yardstick for American resilience. They are the ghosts that stand at the edge of every winter, reminding us that we are only as strong as the person whose hand we hold in the dark. The physical artifacts of the Donner Party, the rusted tools, the porcelain fragments, and the heavy iron wagon tires, did not just disappear into museums. For many years, they were the center of a quiet, intense debate regarding the ownership of tragedy. In the late 19th century, as the site became more accessible via the railroad, a black market for Donner relics emerged. Families of the survivors were horrified to find that pieces of their parents' cabins were being sold as curiosities in San Francisco and New York. This commodification of pain forced a new level of legal protection for historical sites in California. It was the first time in American history that a site of civilian tragedy was treated with the same reverence as a battlefield. The Donner relics eventually found a home in the state capitol and later the Donner Memorial Museum. But for decades, they served as a painful reminder that to the world, their life and death struggle was merely a story to be collected. This friction between private grief and public history remains a defining characteristic of the Donner legacy, reminding us that some stories are too heavy to ever truly be owned by the public. As the survivors aged into the 20th century, the Donner secret began to take on a new form, the genetic legacy. Modern researchers have often wondered if the survivors possessed a specific biological resilience. While no survival gene has been identified, the descendants of the Donner Party have frequently been studied for their intergenerational resilience. the psychological strength passed down through family stories and cultural habits. The children who survived the lake camp went on to live unusually long lives for the era, many reaching their 80s and 90s. It was as if the winter of 46 had hardened them, creating a biological iron that resisted the common ailments of the time. They became the patriarchs and matriarchs of the New West, their bloodlines intertwining with the founding families of modern California. To look at the census records of California today is to see the ghost of the Donner Party. Thousands of citizens carry the DNA of those who refused to die in the snow. They are the living rebuttal to the mountain's indifference, a biological victory that continues to unfold nearly 2 centuries later.
The final mystery we must address is the silence of the dogs. In the early days of the encampment, the party had several loyal dogs who had traveled with them from Illinois. In the journals, these animals disappear early on, mentioned only briefly as the first alternative food source. The emotional toll of sacrificing the family protectors, animals that had guarded the children across 2,000 miles of prairie, was a breaking point for many of the pioneers. It was the moment they realized that the old world rules no longer applied. To kill the dog was to kill the last vestige of the domestic dream. For the Reed children, who had grown up with these animals, it was their first true introduction to the cold reality of the Sierras. This loss of innocence was repeated 87 times over in different ways, but the silence of the dogs remains one of the most poignant symbols of the tragedy. It marked the transition from a group of travelers with pets and possessions to a pack of survivors with nothing but their own breath and the clothes on their backs. As the sun sets on our narrative, we look at the Donner Pass through the lens of the 21st century. The pass is now a marvel of human engineering, but it remains a place of profound atmospheric weight. Pilots flying over the region often comment on the unique weather patterns that still emerge without warning, turning the sky from blue to a bruised purple in minutes. The Donner Party is no longer a news item or a scandal. It has become a mythic archetype. It is the story we tell when we want to discuss the limits of human nature. It sits alongside the great tragedies of history, the Titanic, the Franklin expedition, the Andes flight disaster, as a testament to the fact that we are never truly masters of our environment. We are merely guests, permitted to stay as long as we respect the rules of the wild. The pioneers of 1846 learned those rules at a terrible price, and their story remains the textbook for every generation that dares to believe the world is easily conquered. We end where we began, with the dream of California. The 87 members of the Donner Party were not looking for tragedy. They were looking for a home. They were looking for a place where the sun always shone and the soil was always rich. In a strange, dark way, they found it. They didn't settle on the land they intended, but they became a permanent part of the land itself. Their names are now on the lakes, the mountains, the streets, and the schools. They are the foundation of the state's identity. The Donner Party is the ultimate reminder that the American dream is not a gift, but a purchase. One that was bought with the courage of those who were willing to risk everything for a future they could only see in their minds. As the fire of this story finally fades into the embers of history, we honor them. Not for how they died, but for the incredible, terrifying, and beautiful way they fought to live.